Welcome again to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program in which we study the book of Revelation multi-generationally and discover God's surprises sometimes for our lives today. I'm Jon Paulien, professor of religion at Loma University, and next to me is
Sigve Tonstad. I'm a pastor at Campus Hill Church.
I'm Viana Chambers, and I'm a pastor at the Calamasa Church.
And I'm Guilherme Borda, and I'm a student at Andrews University, New Testament Studies, and focusing on Revelation.
And since you're a student at Andrews University, how come you're in California?
Well, my wife is a student at Loma University, and she's doing medical school here. So that's what brought us here. I joke with my friends from Andrews that I am in exile, but I also compliment and say, but it's a great place to be in exile in.
Yeah,
That's
when I
true.
find out it's 70 degrees in January every so often, that's, yeah.
Patmos is not so bad.
Yeah, and again, that's the interesting thing about Patmos. You know, we often think of John being a prisoner on Patmos, but every time I've been on Patmos, I said, I could live with this. It's really a very beautiful place, and the climate is just so mild and pleasant. So I think we'll want to talk to John when we get an opportunity and say, what was it like to be a prisoner on Patmos? And he'll say, it was all in God's plan.
Paradise.
God knew what was best for me, and I spent my old age in my favorite place. Yeah, something like that. Awesome. Well, we've been talking about the seventh trumpet, and we've been talking about the positive side. We're going to get into the other side in this program. But at the close there, we were talking about worship, and I think you made a comment about it off the air that I think our audience might like to know about.
Yeah, I think that many people may wonder, why should we worship God, and why is it bad if I refuse to worship God, right? Because later you will have things like in chapter 14, verse 6 and 7, fear God and give Him glory because the hour of His judgment is come, right? So I think the book gives a number of reasons for worshiping God, the things He has done, right? So creation, redemption, and His works, His holiness, but also judgment. So the question arises, why is it so bad if I say, sure, God is the creator and He's redeemed us, but thank you very much, I don't want to worship Him. I think there's a number of things that we may think to help us see why refusing to worship God is actually such a bad thing. The first thing I would say is that whereas true worship is ennobling and makes us better people, false worship is actually oppressive and degrading. Think about it. The book of Revelation does not talk about worship in a vacuum, just like worship God or there's no alternative. There are alternatives. You have people who worship demons, who worship idols, who worship the beast, who worship the dragon. Now, think about this. On one side, you can worship God and become more like Him.
Yeah.
On the other side, you can worship the dragon, the beast, demons, who do not have your best interest in mind. This is an oppressive relationship. Or you can worship idols. This is really degrading. When you think about like human beings were put on earth to lovingly and in a serving way rule earth in a caring way, and now you're going to worship just like a piece of wood. So it's very degrading. Now, but there's more than that. Another reason why refusing to worship God would be bad is because if worship is an expression of thankfulness, as we see here, like we give thanks to you because of what God has done, refusing to worship Him in light of all that He has done is ingratitude. That's a moral failure. So it is actually, I would suggest that conscious, informed refusal to worship God is actually immoral because it is ingratitude. But not only that, it is refusing to submit to God, it is disobedience, therefore rebellion, and it refuses to acknowledge God as God. So it's almost like if God is worthy to be worshipped, and He is God, but I refuse to worship Him, I am denying, rejecting that claim, right? In my life, I'm going against the very claim of God's worthiness, His divinity, who He is. it's almost like some sort of a reverse blasphemy, so to speak, or silent blasphemy in a sense, right? Now, take this with a grain of salt, but in a sense, it's almost like saying God is not God. He's not worthy to worship. I refuse to acknowledge that worthiness. So it's actually unfair. It's we like to talk about justice and fairness. It's so it's really bad, actually. It's bad for us. It's bad for the world around us because we end up being engaged in these oppressive, degrading relationships.
Well, doesn't it come back to what we talked about in the previous program?
I think so.
And that's the idea. What matters is who are you going to worship?
Exactly.
Seems like we all worship something. I know some people who just worship Star Wars, just that whole story and the music and everything. It's what they focus on almost all the time.
But Baby Yoda.
Yeah,
No, I'm just kidding.
so cute,
Don't
right?
touch
Or
Baby
whatever.
Yoda.
Yeah, okay. You see, so we're all going to focus on something. We all have something, and perhaps a word maybe more helpful than worship is admire. If who you admire is who you become like. And in Psalms it talks about we become like the God we worship. So worship, some people say, that sounds like God is an egotist. Everybody's got to worship me, me. No. If God is who He has demonstrated Himself to be in Jesus Christ, then it's not egotism that requires worship.
Right.
It is His loving concern for us. This is what is best for us. If we worship that which elevates, we will become like that. If we worship something else, we will spiral down into misery. And we see that with Satan and his angels that have chosen to worship something other, to worship power, to worship self.
Right.
It goes into a spiral that's brought all the evil that we experience in this world.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, that's why I think what you said last session, so if you haven't already, you might want to see that after this, is so important, which is that the component of retelling God's work is a vital component. It's everywhere where worship is mentioned, right, in Revelation.
Yeah.
So in essence, false worship is when you don't really know what God has done. Right? So that's what I'm thinking when I'm hearing
Instead, you attribute all the good things in your life to something or someone else.
Because if you really knew that it was God and not that someone else or something else, and also if you really knew what God did, like the gravity, the beauty of this mystery that God did, I think it would be natural, almost natural, to respond in admiration. That might be more complicated, but yeah, let's just leave it there.
And I mean, worship not only makes us better and in tune with the universe, it makes us feel good. I mean, worship satisfies you. It has, existentially, it is fulfilling. Right?
Yes.
And you mentioned, like, we always worship something, right? Even if just self, actually, right? But none of these alternatives are satisfying. So the only way, because human beings were created as worshiping creatures. So you can't get away from it. You are going to worship, right? You are going to submit, you are going to worship, you're going to seek something that, in a sense, transcends yourself. So the only thing, the only object of worship that truly satisfies is God. So worship is good. It feels good. It satisfies. It makes you flourish.
Yeah.
I feel like throwing a hand grenade into the room here at this
please.
point. Was the tree of life, were the fruits of the tree of life magical, life-giving, force, or is it a symbol? Because if the source of life is really the glory of God, then to cut yourself off from the source of life, worship is basking in the glory of God. Cut yourself off from the source of life is to mean that source of life becomes a source of death. You see, that this glory of God can become destructive at the end, not because God wants to destroy us. When the wicked are being destroyed, God is going to be like in Hosea saying, how can I give you up? How can I let you go? But people who refuse to bask in the glory of God, who refuse to enjoy and worship that. You know, tree of life, as I would understand it, it's an extension. It's like a symbol of the fact that it is the presence of God that brings life.
It really is.
In the universe. And the God sustains the entire universe through His glory and through His power. And it's a life-giving glory, but if you harbor that within yourself, which goes against that, it can become self-destructive.
Absolutely.
So what would compel this group of people who have refused to acknowledge who God is and what He has done and worship Him? Like, I'm trying to get into that mindset of like, what is so compelling about their side that they would say, we see this life-giving thing, maybe they don't, like there is this life-giving thing, and as we're talking about them, it kind of sounds like they're ignorant, they're not really acknowledging the good things of life and so many other things. It almost, their side doesn't seem to make sense, but yet they're stuck there. How can we understand them being so permanently sure of their side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it makes sense when you constrict your point of view, when you constrict the horizons. This makes sense because it's about self. The opposite of the worship way is the self way. And when self is the focus, I want what's best for me, you have two options. You have short-term and long-term happiness. If you go for the short term, well, taking this drug will make me feel a whole lot happier in the next 2 minutes. Mm-hmm, okay? Mm-hmm. You may even know it's destructive, but you can't help yourself because the next 2 minutes are all that really matters to you. So in the short term, self is supported by buying this stuff, eating that stuff, taking that drug, drinking that substance, etc. It's all about self. But God says, actually, if you really cared about self, if you really cared about what's best for you, you would want what I have, because I not only want what's best for you, I have the power to make it happen. When you choose against me, you're choosing the short-term trash that seems to do it all for you. So worship, you know, at first glance can almost seem egotistical on God's part, but if God truly is who He has demonstrated Himself to be, then it is really in our own self-interest to worship Him.
It's just in aligning with reality.
Life. Yeah, bask in that life-giving glory, you see. And we'll be doing it in eternity.
Yeah, I think though we have to be aware of this concept and keeping that at the forefront, because I think of I fall into this sense of superiority quite a bit. And so I read this and I hear your comments and I'm tempted to walk out of this room and say, oh, you ignorant people, like, oh, you just have no concept of what's good for you. And kind of look down on them as like, sorry, you're not gonna get saved, but I am. You know, in that kind of sense, I feel like we just have to be careful of that, and I'm speaking to myself.
And the next time you're confronted with a cookie out of season, all of that stuff of looking down at others now gets turned on yourself, right? Because we're all weak. We all tend to look at the short term, and that's why we need Scripture. That's why we need the book of Revelation, among other things, to keep reminding us there's something bigger to focus on. There's something eternal to focus on. When you're simply focused on this life, when you're simply focused on this limited horizon, things can make a ton of sense that are in the end destructive.
Yeah.
So.
And it really is a beautiful thing to bask in that glory, as you're saying. There's a quote, I'm going to paraphrase it, and it basically just lists all the things that do not satisfy, right? And do not give the world your greatest gift that you could give. So, you know, your education's not the greatest gift you could give, all these different ways that you could gain pedigree on this side of eternity. It is only one thing. It is the fruit that comes from you being in the presence of Jesus. And when you bask in that glory, in that tree of life glory, right? The source of life, and you're fed and you're basking in it and you're beholding and you're changed, what comes out of that is just the best thing you could give just from being in the presence of Christ. And that's the beauty of worship, is that it satisfies you and it satisfies others.
the caricature of heaven is, the harps and the clouds.
That's the caricature.
What heaven is really about is basking in the life-giving presence of God.
That's it.
Absolutely.
And that in that presence we achieve our fullest self. Yeah. All right, wow. And that's, we haven't even read a text yet, but that's just
mercy.
spilling over from the previous program. And if you missed that program, go on to the website, LLBN.tv, and you can find archived some of the previous programs that you may have missed. And you won't want to miss the one for last week if you didn't get it, because that's the foundation for what we were doing here. And you were telling me now, I said something about fear. We have fear God, give him glory.
Yeah.
The word fear is easily misunderstood because obeying God because of fear is the lowest level of motivation.
That's right.
See, we're talking about obeying God at a higher level of motivation, which is to say, God wants what's best for me. I embrace his will for my life because that's the best thing for me and that's what I want. That's a different motivation for obedience than saying, well, I'm afraid he'll punish me if I don't do it.
So sometimes we'll say, fear God, right? Just as the remnant in chapter 11 did. They feared God and gave glory. But then we'll say, but don't obey out of fear.
Right.
So don't fear God. So
Wouldn't it
maybe
be
let's
cool?
just clarify that.
Wouldn't it be cool if there was one text in the Bible that used fear in both ways?
Yes.
Yes.
Show us.
Then you could see it without it.
Yeah.
Exodus
I feel like you
20, verse 20. If there was ever a time when they had reason to be
that's cool.
terrified, scared,
The Ten
out of their
Commandments.
wits, it was right after the presentation of the Ten Commandments, all the thunder and the lightning and the loud noises, etc.
Nice.
And what is Moses' conclusion to the giving of the Ten Commandments? Verse 20 of chapter 20. And Moses said to the people, do not fear. Well, let's go back. Let's go back to verse 18. All right? You just got the Ten Commandments.
I already saw it.
Now, when all the people perceived the thunderings and the lightnings and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood afar off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will hear, but don't let God speak to us. We're going to die. And what does Moses say? Do not fear, for God has come to prove you that the fear of him may be before your eyes, that you may not sin. All right? Don't be afraid. Don't be scared of the thunder and all the rest of that.
That his fear.
But God, like a good school teacher, knows he's got to get your attention first before you can get the good things that he'd like to give. He wants respect. You got to respect the teacher before you love the teacher. And so God sometimes gives us what we need. At Mount Sinai, they needed a big show. But Moses says, now don't get the wrong impression. The big show doesn't mean you need to be terrified of God. You need to be scared out of your wits. No. Honor, respect, awe, worship, yes, that's what fear means in the spiritual sense. So you have that double meaning.
Wow. So that's a cool text. I have a question for you, Viana. Like when you hear the school teacher analogy, what was your true reaction? Was it a cringe? Was it a?
It was.
Yes, it was a cringe.
Did you sense it?
Yes. It's cringe-worthy, right?
Yeah, it's almost like you better sit down and be quiet or else, like.
Do not fear me, but you should fear me.
Do not speak up, I
But
dare
you know, the teachers that I ended up loving the most
That
are
is
the ones
true.
that got my respect and my attention early
true.
on.
Yeah.
And it enabled me to learn from them.
Yeah.
Whereas there were some teachers who wanted to be my best buddy, and in the end it was chaos.
And then you don't respect them, and you don't learn. So these are all true statements, but I'm making the point that our generation recoils. We recoil from statements like this, right? Don't fear me, but fear me. Like, okay, what is it?
Manipulative.
So tell us more.
Yeah, well, I was hoping Viana would take us into view. Do you feel the same way too, Guilherme?
I kind of wonder if maybe it's helpful to think about the usefulness of fear along the using an analogy with pain. Because even though there are aspects of fear that are respect, I think there are aspects that are like, I'm dying, right? John walked with Jesus for years, and he was so close, but when Jesus appeared in Patmos, it's just, wow, but Jesus says, don't be afraid, right? But whether it is God's intention or not, I think it's undeniable that when people have these encounters with God, these theophanies and all of this, they actually feel afraid. Now, on the other hand, people who work in the medical field and are familiar with syndromes or diseases and that eliminate pain, they know how bad that can be, right? And I think that especially when you are in an environment like they were, where, and scholars will debate whether there was a lot of persecution going on at that time, but it's undeniable that there was persecution either before or later, or at some point before or later. So in the ballpark of that time in history, there was persecution. When you have the empire telling you, you do this or I'll kill you, it doesn't seem to be a bad thing if God says, you fear those who kill the body. And it's just a temporary thing. You should fear God, because then the punishment is permanent. So it's like a child. So if I know some parents who are kind of friends of mine, and it's interesting, we go on this journey, right? We see each other parenting, and hopefully we'll learn from each other. And sometimes you're in a place and you have a bunch of kids, and then one kid decides it's just the most awesome thing to run toward the road. And just exciting, right? It's not exciting, it's terrible. Then what do you do with a child like that? I think that sometimes just sitting down with your kid and saying, son, don't do that. That's not good for you. At an early age, may not cut it. At an early age, it may be that they need to feel some fear to protect them. So I think fear is protective. Fear is actually part of a relationship of love, where there is someone who knows so much more, and there is an enemy who also knows so much more than you, who tries to bully you into following his way. So I kind of embrace it in a sense, you see. So I see how there's the aspect of respect and all of that, but I also tend to kind of embrace the idea of fear in a sense, especially when we don't understand everything. Because there's going to be all these bullies in our lives trying to, get the light out of us and make us afraid and make us compromise. And so God may remind us, well, you may, be afraid of them killing you, but otherwise there is the burning fire. Which one do you prefer? So that may sound like bad.
I'm still recoiling.
That may sound like bad, but I'll
generation.
tell you one thing. I think that especially when you take into account different cultures and how God has to speak to people in different ways, it's not everybody that, and especially, you got to remember, the gospel is preached in a lot of places, and some people that have very little access to it, and they know very little. So sometimes, fear is very helpful, but it's not just fear. You gotta remember, it is fear in the context of a love. So I get the respect part, but I kind of personally tend to embrace the
I want to hear further from.
But I'm willing to learn.
The women.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
So jump in. Did you want to jump in?
No, go for it.
Okay. So someone without inhibition, right, is someone that has lost a marble or two, right? Like if you don't have inhibition, it's not healthy. So fear helps us to have our inhibition in its proper place. I agree that there is place for that type of fear. So fear that leads to protection, that leads to health, the fact that there is a kind of fear that could do that in our conversation, is an interesting concept that I think might be good for the generation to explore. But a lot of the fear that I guess we have observed, and I can't speak on behalf of the generation at this point, but I'm just observing it, is fear that leads to shame, right? And so I think that is the kind of fear, the fear that leads to shame, or that comes from shame, is what the Word of God is talking about when in 1 John 4, perfect love. No, yes. Perfect love casts out all fear. So it casts out all reasons to be ashamed, right? So don't fear. You don't have any reason to be ashamed, right? Because God is about to redeem us. God is all of that. But we want to protect you. So may God's fear be with you. Sounds a little bit more like I can lean into that. What do you think? Is that language?
Yeah, because I feel like emotions some of them have been very vilified, over time. It's like, you can't be angry, you can't be sad, like, you can't be afraid, like, be happy.
Don't be depressed, don't be down.
And they're all neutral, right? They're just emotions, and fear happens to be one of them that I feel like we have to start giving it its rightful place in a platform of neutral emotions again. And I think, yes, once you go down into like secondary places like shame, that's when you're like, okay, let's stop right there. Let's bring it back to just fear, like where it's still neutral and it has its place, like you were saying, it's protective, and it has so many benefits to allowing yourself to know fear, to dwell in fear, and make that part of the revolving emotions that you live in.
Whoa.
And the fear, God, I think one point that needs to be made clear is God will accept worship based on fear.
Wow.
God will accept obedience based on hoping for a reward. I mean, the rewards are offered in the book of Revelation. So the beauty of it is that God will accept it, but it's so much better when the obedience, when the worship arises out of less selfish means.
Yes.
And the point I would make is, and we wouldn't use the word fear to talk about the gospel today. Okay, that is jarring, etc. The Bible is an ancient book. God was meeting people where they were, and we need to translate that into today's world. That's why you folk are here, you see. Some of us may have been with this word anciently longer than some of you, but at the same time, we've got to translate it into a new generation and translate it into a new context. And we would not use the word fear to describe the gospel probably today because it's so open to misunderstanding.
And we should not miss the fact that Revelation wants to make us courageous people, right? Way at the end, who knows, episode 550, I don't know. Right, there's the cowards are outside of the city. Right?
That's right.
I think, I may have heard this somewhere, but when you fear God, you don't have to fear anything else.
Yes.
You can be brave and courageous.
And that's a great note for us to close on, to recognize that in the book of Revelation, there's this other side, the courage on the one hand.
Yes.
Honor God is I guess the best way to talk about fear as it was meant in Revelation.
That's it.
Thank you again. Amen. This is GPS. See you again next week.